between action and change. And I think that difference between action and change is one of the biggest differences in speakers who wow the crowd and speakers who also change the crowd. Because in order for a change to last, the action has to last. That ball of your audience needs to continue to keep rolling. And in order to do that, unlike a ball, it needs its own way. It needs to be powered from the inside. Someone said it needs more energy. And you're 100% right. But let me back up a little bit, because there is a reason, other than my magic trick, that ball was so large, and it's because it belongs to Hazel and Walnut. So Hazel and Walnut, I know, been without my dogs for like 7 days. It's a long time. Well, they are standard greyhounds, so they are very large. And something I need to explain to you about them is that neither of them started out as a pet. In fact, this was Hazel doing her job. Hazel is from Ireland. Hazel is what was known as a hare courser. Walnut was retired from the track. And this is probably what you think of when you think about greyhounds. Like, man, they must be really active. Anybody else have greyhounds? Any other greyhound moms in here, dads in here? Then you know what they really are like. Right. Synchronized napping. They're like really working on that routine. Okay. Now, because neither Hazel or Walnut had trained to be a pet, right, we had to teach them to be a pet. And since neither my husband nor I had made that kind of transformational change with a dog before, we hired Vivian. Now, Vivian told us 2 very important things to understand about dogs. But I immediately saw the connection, as one does, to other things that are perhaps appropriate to what we're talking about today. And that is that if that ball were one of our dogs, there are 2 things that they will willingly do always on their own. That they are, in other words, internally motivated to do. Those 2 things are keep doing what they like doing and stop doing what they don't. Right? If I'm getting scritches and I'm playing with my friends, if I'm getting belly rubs, I want to keep doing that. And if you're asking me to go into a place that I don't want to go, or if you're like Hazel, or Peachy Pacey, as we call her, and it's cold, hot, wet, or anything, she doesn't want to go outside. So everything else from there is a negotiation. Now that's important for us to understand, because if we're not thinking about that fact, that whether we're talking about dogs or whether we're talking about audience members, promise I don't conflate them, then what we're trying to do is figure out what is it that we have to do in order to get that reaction. Because one of the most important things to understand about this is that because change is a reaction, if you are the person introducing this change, a huge part of the likelihood of that change ever happening rests with you. Because a huge part of what people are responding to when they're hearing this information about change is you and how you're presenting that change in the first place. And one of the biggest dangers to change, and honestly, this is probably if you remember nothing else from today, and I want you to remember this guy. One of the biggest dangers to change is what is known as reactance. And that's what happens when people resist a change because they feel forced to make it. So when you tell someone, you must do this, or you present something, even casually from the stage, as if there's no option, their natural wiring is to regain control of the situation and push back. But you know what's fascinating about this? Is that when someone tells you what to do, and you get this reaction engaged, people will say no to things they otherwise would have said yes to, just because they feel forced into the change that you're saying. Now, this may go against some of us were taught when it comes to what do we say on stage and how we have confidence and how we have competence in front of our audience. But this is real. And it's not something that's controlled by somebody's rational brain. So everything that we're doing when we're trying to introduce a change is to align it with the reaction that we want. Because your approach to a change, especially from the stage, can just as easily impede a change as inspire one. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, Tamsen, I'm not a dog, that's a dog. I just had to do that. Expression on her face. This is Hazel. So the thing is that there are certain of these concepts, particularly that people like to keep doing what they like doing and they like to stop doing what they don't like doing, that are true whether or not we're talking about people or dogs. But one thing that we have as an advantage over dogs is that we have developed other parts of our brains. This sweet girl is operating with a smooth little apricot in her head. And we've got a much, much, much bigger brain. And thankfully, Perry gave us some indicators of that yesterday. So just by show of hands so I can see what's going on here, if anyone's ever had a dog or an animal that they had to train, would you please raise your hand so I can see you? Thank you. And all right, now thank you very much. So some of this is going to be familiar about this. Now, there are some similarities between dogs and children. For instance, both of them will tell you when they need to go outside. They're very responsive to treats. And you know what? I can't get either of them off the phone. So let me just see, raise your hands if you have had the care or the care and feeding of a child, whether yours or somebody else's, perhaps, as a spectacular auntie. Thank you very much. And now, finally, I'd like to see you raise your hand if you have ever been a child or a dog. Okay, so thank you very much. You can put your hands down. So this should all be familiar to you. But what's so fascinating about this is that when we're thinking about building buy-in for change, for whatever reason, all the stuff that we seem to think and know intuitively seems to go out the window. But see, I have been fascinated by this question of how do you build buy-in for change? How do you create transformational change? Since Kristen so beautifully opened the door, since I had my first panic attack when I was 17 years old. And trust me, if you have ever had a panic disorder or a panic attack, you spend most of your time trying to figure out how to never have one again. But I had that experience for 17 years before I figured out how not to have one again. But that wasn't the only change that I made. And so what I noticed was that I picked up these lessons along the way. And I started to use them not only for myself, but for other people. So, for instance, I moonlighted as a Weight Watchers leader for 13 years. That's a whole different keynote. And I also started doing things like working with academics, researchers, scientists for TEDx talks. And I am still the idea strategist for one of only 9 legacy-level TEDx events in the world. And I've taken, thank you, appreciate that. And I've actually had 9 of my speakers have their talks promoted to TED.com. These are the lessons that I'm going to share with you today. But if I were to sum up everything that I've learned over now these 30 years that I have been studying this question about how do we help people, how do we speed up the process, understanding and adopting new, important ideas so that we can create the impact and the change that we want, sum it up in one phrase. We need to say what they can't unhear. And speakers, we are uniquely qualified for this. Because what I mean by saying what they can't unhear is that we're talking about spreading with our audiences recognizable truths that crystallize, corrupt, or crack open how they see the world. So, you are not meant to read any of this. It is what is known as an art slide. Yet, on here are some of my favorite things. See, because for me, a big idea, something that I couldn't unhear, didn't just show up as a light bulb in my brain. It always came with a sound. Ding. So I would hear something like, a life lived in fear is a life half lived, and ding. That set me on the course of figuring out how to live without pain. I heard you can't get healthy by being unhealthy. Ding. And that set me on a course for losing 50 pounds 26 years ago and maintaining it every year since. So, thanks. Y'all, awesome, thanks. But this is what we are so good at speakers. These are our phrases that pay, right? These are amazing things that we say to people. And when they say it, when they hear it, when we say it and they hear it, ding, it can set the engine running for change that lasts for life. And I don't know about you, but that is why, even in the midst of my panic disorder, I would still get on stages like this. But how do we do that? How do we ensure that happens? Because a lot of times it can feel like lightning strike, right? So it isn't just one principle. What I did in my new book is I pulled them together, and there are 9. Don't worry, I will touch them all today, but because of our time, I'm not going to be able to go into great depth on any of them. Is that all right with you? Yes? Fabulous. Okay. What was that? You want all of them. See me after. I'm happy to chat. Yeah. Okay. So the other thing I want to share, thanks to what Kristen opened up, is that I am fairly sure, and I have an assessment coming up, that I am actually fairly high functioning autism, which means that we have a tendency to what is known as info dump. So I'm like holding myself in here, like a lot. And Twist, who was kind enough to share dinner with me last night, knows that you get me rolling on something, I'm going to keep rolling. But let's roll on this. All right. Because when we're speakers and we say, oh, I can say what they can't on here, we tend to go right for the words, right? We try to go, especially if we're trying to think about what's my tagline? How am I going to differentiate? What's going on the slides? We go straight to the words. But one thing that I've discovered all these years, not only as a speaker, but as a brand strategist and a message designer, is the great authoress Agatha Christie once wrote, words are only the outer clothing of ideas. Which means if we don't really have as deep of an understanding of what we're trying to say on stage as we think we do, that's when the words get hard. If we don't have a really deep understanding of what we stand for and what and how we're different than other people who are in the same space or talk about the same topic, then the words will be hard to find. But these principles, I hope, will help you understand a little bit about how to crack the code so they become a little bit easier. And one of the most important things is that everything, every idea, every change, every decision that you make or you're asking your audience to make has a story behind it. If you can find the story, and I'll explain what I mean in just a minute, then the words become a lot easier. So what do I mean by this? Well, that was a little bit about what my first book was about. It was called Find Your Red Thread, How to Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible. And in that book, thanks. That's nice. And in that book, what I was doing was I created a standard story structure that, yes, includes the hero's journey, but also is adaptable to other forms of stories. So you may know the hero's journey. There's a quest, there's a call, there's a refusal of the call, there's a mentor, there's a rising action, there's a falling action, and it's a lot of steps. And hero's journeys actually have very specific rules that don't always apply. Just for instance, for example, that a hero's journey always needs a villain. Like there's always a villain. But I work with a lot of nonprofits, a lot of social action groups. There's not a villain in those cases. So I wanted to know, how could we still get the benefits of story by using something else? And what I discovered was that this pattern of stories, these 5 elements in every story, are actually the 5 elements that we need in order to make sense of any information. And so what that book was about was saying, how do I take an idea, break it into those elements, and then make it even more understandable to an audience? And that way I could take even a really new, complex idea and kind of upload it directly into the story processors of somebody's brain. But that story didn't always work. And maybe you've had that experience too, where whether you told a story or structured your talk like a story, it was great. You felt really good about it. But somehow it just didn't drive the action you were looking for. Has that ever happened to anybody? Just clap if yes. Okay. Does that really frustrate the heck out of you too? Because it did me. And so I wanted to keep exploring, and what I found was a modification of every decision has a story. They're both still true, but this is another way to think about it. That there's a long-standing storytelling maxim that says that a story is an argument. And I wondered if that's true. Because if you think about it, every action we take ends an internal argument about why that action does or doesn't make sense. So if the argument makes sense, then the decision will make sense. And if the argument doesn't make sense, then the decision won't make sense. But if you're thinking to yourself, oh, I don't know about that, Tamsen, just let me see again by a show of hands, how many of you people have ever been to IKEA? Okay, thank you for the clapping, because she's like waving all around, like, yes. All right, now, let's go up by, because I really can't see you. By clapping, I would like you to clap if you have ever left IKEA having bought something that you did not plan to buy. All right, there might be a moment where you're like, oh, my people are here. Well, it turns out, thanks to a study from the University College of London, that 60% of purchases at IKEA are unplanned. What? Now think about that. You had this person that was going in, I'm like, I'm going to go buy a Fnork, right? And then you go in there, and then you're like, oh my gosh, but there's a blank, and I got to have that, right? So you say to yourself, oh, I'm going to buy this because I need it. Why do I need it? Because I want it. Now, on the surface of that, that sounds super logical, right? Well, I need this because it had because in it. It's logical. But here, my friends, is a really important distinction. That may be a logical decision, and it is for a reason I'll explain in just a moment, but it's not a rational one. See, we all, every one of us and every single one of your audience members follows an internal logic for everything that we do. It comes back to that internal argument. So if we want that decision to make sense to somebody else, we need to build that argument in their head. We need to build a story that's even stronger than the one they're telling themselves now about why they aren't doing the thing that you or want them to do, or why they are doing something else than you want them to do. And to help us discover this little piece of information, I'm going to bring in a special guest from several thousand years ago. All right, this is my boy, Aristotle. I know, he's hot. All right, super love Aristotle. Okay, so not only did Aristotle introduce the three-act structure of stories, and I don't think this is an accident, my friends, he also introduced what is essentially a three-act structure of how we make an argument. So Aristotle introduced the simplest form of argument. It's called a syllogism. It won't be on the test, don't worry. But it basically goes like this. If A is true and B is true, then guess what? Then C, which is A plus B, will also be true. Now, you're like, okay, thanks, Tamsen, but what does that actually mean? Let's bring out another guest. This is Walnut. All right, so now when I introduce, like you see that and you're like, well, that's an animal. Oh boy, is he ever. Okay, I know he's the cutest. Okay, and if you look at that, your brain goes, that's an animal. And then you go that, and your brain goes, that's a party hat, right? So that's A, animal, B, party hat. So if I put the party hat on Walnut, what do we have? Yes, we've got a party animal. So right. Okay, now you may not realize it, but your brain is constantly, every time we're out in the world, looking for information, and we're trying to fill in the blanks of these arguments, of these stories that we tell ourselves. And so what I mean by story and argument in this context is not necessarily, oh, once upon a time, there was a bratty kid named Luke who wanted to leave Tatooine. I'm not talking about that. Right? I'm talking about a story where we're creating a cause and effect connection, where we say to ourselves, this is going to happen because, or that person did that because, or that happened because, cause, effect. So when we think about this, every decision has a story, we have to make sure that we are supplying all pieces of that, or else either, I'm just going to back up here for a second, either they're not going to have enough information to make your idea make sense, which means no change. Remember, if the story doesn't make sense, the decision won't make sense. Or sometimes worse, if you leave something in that internal story blank, what might they do? They're going to fill it in themselves. And sometimes they're going to fill it in with something that is not helpful. Just to say. Okay, so the big thing about this, big idea, number one, is that because every decision has a story, because every action ends an internal argument about why that decision does or doesn't make sense, we as speakers or as change makers need to build an argument. And it can be as simple as that. Now, this is going to sit underneath, at the heart, at the core of your talk. It's going to sit at the heart, at the core of all the information you put out there about you. And fundamentally, what it's going to allow you to say is, I believe this is that, because if you take this part and you take this part and you put them together, you will get this result. We will keep coming back to this. Don't worry. We're going to walk through it step by step. But if this is the structure, you might be wondering, well, where do we find the things that go in between? And this is where our next principle comes in, and it is that principles set patterns. Our deep-seated principles, values, beliefs, assumptions, they are the reasons why we do the things that we do, and they are the reasons why the things that we do feel right to us. They are also, by the way, the reasons why somebody else doing something else does not feel right to us. And I'm sure we've had absolutely no examples of that in the last, 5-6 years. COVID. Okay. But this is really important because everything you do, every keynote that you've developed, every desire that you have, every job that you've had, every partner that you've chosen is because something about that person, that job, that place, that idea felt right according to the principles in your head. So for this, we need to go back to this, remember? Because they said all the time, your brain is trying to fill in the blanks of this story. But I didn't quite tell you the whole story. Because most of that filling in the blanks, most of that internal argument creation happens in the dark. And what I mean by the dark here is it happens unconsciously. It happens pre-consciously. Before you don't even know. It's automatic. It's instinctive. And so what this means is not only does every action end an internal argument, but it means that the actions we agree with are based on beliefs we already have. The stories we agree with, the changes we agree with, the politicians we agree with, all of these things, we agree with them because they're based on beliefs we already have. But we don't necessarily know that that is what it's coming from. So, now this can create a very big problem, right? If we're trying to get someone to do something different, we know we need an argument, right? But if they're going to agree with something that is based on what they already have and already believe, what does that tell us about how we fill in the blanks? We're going to build an argument with elements they already agree with. It is the combination that will create the new answer. But by starting with something that is so deep-seated, it feels inherently familiar. So, I'm going to walk this through with a Canadian. That seemed appropriate. So this is my friend and client, Vince Molinaro. He is a leadership speaker. He runs a company called Leadership Contract, LCI. And he wanted to work together to say, okay, how do we put this together? Now, you know it, you love it. It's a Talkadoc QR code. All right, so you can hold on to that, but at the end of that is going to be a kind of high-level worksheet for you to fill out that will help you start to build this kind of case, this kind of argument on your own. But I'm going to walk you through it right here. Okay, so with Vince, all right, let me ask you this. How many people, by applause, again, can't see, are leadership speakers? All right, excellent. Well, your topic is something about leadership. Okay, so this is Vince as well. And Vince understood that for him, where his audience was moving, was that all of his audience members were asking a big question that was, kind of the direction they were moving, was towards how do we successfully execute a strategic shift. Now, do you notice that this is starting with, so for those of you who are leadership speakers, would you agree that a fair number of leaders ask that question? Right? Okay, so I want you to put it back in the context of the ball, because that means what he's doing by putting his message in the path of where they're already moving, he is anchoring his message in something his audience already wants. Now, sometimes this blows people's minds, particularly when I go speak at local chapters of NSA and others, because they're like, but I'm supposed to be different. Not on this question, you're not. Because if they don't know that you solve this question, how are they going to find you? Right? We spend so much time saying, here's this new thing, here's this different thing, here's this other question you should be asking, but they're not there yet. They're just rolling along. So the first thing we need to do, the first place that we're going to anchor this, is in something they already want. Now, you all, most of you, have a big idea. So this was the case for Vince as well. So his answer, like right out of the gate, for how do we successfully execute a strategic shift was 2, scale accountability. Now, those two things together create what I call a core claim. It is the whole reason why Vince is out there on stage, right? It's basically he's there to say, because he deeply believes that to successfully execute a strategic shift, you have to scale accountability. That's what he's going to stand behind. And I'm going to suggest that every single one of us as speakers needs a core claim like that, at least one, to say, this is what I'm here for. Now notice, many people can answer this question. Not as many answer it this way. And he spent so much time focused on this answer that if you talk about this, a lot of times, Vince is who comes up. So building this core claim is really important. Because a lot of times people are, talk to me, again, I've got a long background in marketing and branding, and they say, how do I figure out my positioning? Step 1, take a position. Take a position on something. Now, this by itself is not enough, right? Unless you know Vince, unless you're already convinced that this is the answer, this works. But friends, our audiences are different than they were 10, 20 years ago. And I've been speaking that long, so I can say that. But I'm also going to suggest that I don't think they were ever all that different. In that, we tend to forget that if the audience doesn't already know us, they start skeptical. They're not predisposed to believe us. They're not predisposed to agree with us. So this claim needs a case. It needs an argument that the audience, your audience, can tell themselves about why this is the right answer, about why they need to hire Vince, not just to come speak, but to train, to develop, and coach their leaders. So how do we do that? All right, you remember the pieces, right? So piece 1 is something about scaling accountability that the audience already believes. So here's what we came up with. This is going to sound like it was fast. It didn't take only a day, but I didn't just do it out of my head. So So the first thing we came up with is what's okay, if we're going to try to successfully execute a strategic shift, we decided first to say, what's the first thing we need? We need accountability. Why? This is how we get this first piece. Why? Because accountability, I'm going to shorten it, is the ownership of outcomes. Accountability is the ownership of outcomes. Does anybody disagree with that statement? No. We work really hard to find a nice, big, accurate, specific statement that his ideal client, ideal customer would find very difficult to argue with. If they did argue with it, what do you think it means? Not his client. This goes to this question too. If he's speaking to somebody as a prospect or something like that, who does not have this question, which is part of his core claim, the whole reason why he's on stage in the first place, what does that mean about that prospective client? They are not a client. Because the ball is going to move in the direction it's going to move. Here, all of you leadership speakers, do you have a different answer to this question than scale accountability? Okay, convince this ball. People are everyone's like, what's happening to the ball? Here, the thing is that a lot of times we try to just literally convince someone, say, no, come over here. But we have to give people a reason to move. So, step one, accountability is the ownership of outcomes. Step two, now we need something that covers what? Scale, right? So here's what we came up with. Success, remember, requires execution at scale. You did it. All right. So now you see where this goes. So at the core of his claim, where he can say, I believe that to successfully execute a strategic shift, it's here somewhere, there it is. We scale accountability. Here's why. Because accountability is the ownership of outcomes. And success requires execution at scale. So if we really want to successfully execute a strategic shift, we need to make sure that we are scaling accountability throughout the organization. Because it doesn't matter if just one leader is accountable. And if we're scaling the wrong thing, it's not going to get us there. But together, we can achieve those results. Do you see how that works? Okay. So now you might say, okay, but how do I find things that people already agree with? And this is where the fourth one comes in. This is also where I'm going to start to speed up a little bit, just because we've covered the big stuff, and now we're starting to add a little bit of nuance. It's nuanced. You ready for this? Okay. All right, so identity is the greatest influencer. Now, we do not have the time or the energy to customize every single message and every single keynote and every single case and every single claim to every single person that's out there. We don't. So at this point, we have to rely on things that we know to be true. This is one way, right, to start with concepts that people generally agree with. And this includes, by the way, most concepts of math and science. I will also point out that every single religion or philosophy on earth has some version of what Christianity refers to as the golden rule. But it also applies to politics, right? What do I mean by that? Well, Pew Research Center in the US found that no matter what side of the aisle somebody was on, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, that their number one value was safety of the family. They may come at it from a different reason. They may figure out different reasons, have different ways of doing it, but the deep belief that sits behind it is the family is important enough to protect. So these concepts exist. But there's one other thing I want to add to this. And this is, again, where we're going to go back to Hazel and Walnut, because what does every girl dog and boy dog want to be known as? Good dog! Absolutely. Well, my friends, thanks to, again, a little bit of what Perry was talking about yesterday, we still have a dog brain in us, but we have the rest of this big, beautiful head that came out as well. But we haven't really lost that desire. So when I say that identity is the greatest influencer, that people act according to how they want to be seen, one of the most important things to understand about all people is that they share this desire. That everybody, everywhere, or at least to the point where I have not been able to find research that does not yet support this, people want to be seen as smart, capable, and good. Now, they may not always believe that they are, but darn tootin', they want to be seen that way. They want to be seen that way. And so anything that you do that somehow implies that they are not smart, not capable, not good, is going to set off this reaction. Now, you might not think that you're doing that. You might not realize that it's happening, but just an example that most of us have probably experienced. Have you ever been on a website and then you were offered some kind of offer or deal that was supposed to give you a discount or something, and then you said no, but the button you had to push to get the annoying little pop-up to go away had something super snarky in it, like, no thanks, I like paying too much. What the heck? All you have to say is no, not yet. Because what is it doing? It's saying, well, you're not smart because. Now, it might in the moment make you go, oh, I don't want them to feel that way about me. I'm going to click. But guess what? That moment where you've made that decision out of FOMO or shame or pain, I'm going to get to that one, is a moment where that person's brain is in full-on dog mode. It's in that fast part of the brain. It's what you may, Daniel Kahneman calls, and Stanovich and West, I'm a geek. I own it. Info dump. Okay. System 1, system 2. Fast brain, slow brain. Lizard, monkey, dog, alligator. I've heard a lot of different things, like human beautiful brain. Okay. But what happens is that in that moment where somebody is afraid or in pain or in shame, they're operating from here. And do you know what that means? That is cut off their access to this part. What does that mean? They lose the ability to make. They lose the ability to make a rational decision. Which means the moment that situation that has created that irrational dog brain moment goes away, guess what happens? This brain takes over and says, that website sucks. Or it says, that salesperson manipulated me into this. This, my friends, is often where buyer's remorse comes from. So the test for this is to look at everything you do and say, does it help someone be seen as smart, capable, and good? And my friends, I gently invite you to examine whether or not your language, whether it's spoken or written, is somehow making that smart, capable goodness conditional. Meaning that somehow you are implying or even saying outright that you will only become smart, capable, and good if you do this. Because I will tell you something, that dog brain is highly attuned to intent. And if it senses even a little bit that you don't think that they are smart, capable, and good, you've lost one of the 2 pillars of trust. Because trust, research shows, is based on 2 things, capability and intent. And unless you're a psychopath, and I mean this seriously, you cannot hide evidence of your true intent over time. Okay. You with me so far? No, I've lost you completely. Where did you go? Okay, you're here. All right. Now, you might be saying, okay, this is fine, but the whole thing we're doing is that we've got all these deep beliefs that we're trying to operate against. And you're going to say, well, duh, Tamsen, the deepest beliefs are hardest to shift. You just said that we were smart, capable, and good. We know this one already. Now, I want to point out something to you. And to this, I'm going to add one extra little bit of detail. And that is, the longer we believe something, the stronger we believe it. Would you agree? Right. So that means, which are the strongest beliefs? Oldest beliefs, right? They are the beliefs actually that go all the way back to pre-verbal childhood when we say, like, if this happens. Ooh, guess what that sounds like? Now, what that means is that a lot of times it seems to make sense that if we want to make a change, then we need to change the belief, right? Except, has that ever felt like really hard where you're like on the left side of the slide trying to like push it uphill? It's because the longer we believe something, the stronger we believe it. And because of everything we've talked about before, if we try to say to someone, don't believe that, what have we done? We've made them feel not smart, not capable, not good. So, what do we do, Tamsen? Look at those deep beliefs as something to build on instead. Do you notice here that I didn't hear a single person argue with either of those things? When was the last time you were in a group of this many people and you found a statement that everybody could pretty much agree on? So these exist. And the whole idea of this is within that structure we're talking about, when we're filling it in with beliefs, we are filling it in with beliefs that are very hard to shift. Beliefs that have been there from the beginning, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you, like the safety and security and the sanctity of the family, like what goes up must come down, like when you push a ball in motion stays in motion. But so does a mind, right? A mind in motion stays in motion. So you can use these concepts and adapt them to your own concept. When you do this, I've already taken care of this for you in a lot of ways by putting them in this order, but what you do by following these general guidelines to this point is that you avoid the biggest enemy of change, and that is pain. Now, how many of you have ever heard, by a show of applause, that you need to make the pain of the status quo exceed the pain of change before somebody will change? You've heard it. Okay. Given what I've told you so far, do you start to see the problem? Right? That a brain in pain cannot make a rational decision. Not only that, a brain in pain, an anxious brain, a fearful brain, a shameful brain cannot learn. It can't hear you. It can't. Despite how much somebody wants to, but if they're in pain, they can't hear you. So any action they take is just trying to reduce what they're feeling in the moment. So yes, action, if that's what you're looking for, one-time action, pain is the ally of quick action. But remember, change isn't just an action, it's a reaction. So if we want that sustained action, then pain becomes the enemy of change. Our jobs as change makers, as speakers, as idea creators, as message makers, is to, at every point possible, reduce the pain of the decision. So what we're trying to do is show how their previous thinking actually makes sense in the context of them being smart, capable, and good people. We're trying to talk about how all of this is explainable and how there is a new place to go that's based on things they already know to be true. When you do this, my friends, you get into something very, very powerful. But in order to do this, we have to put those two things against each other. Now, you may have heard the saying that F. Scott Fitzgerald said it's a mark of high intelligence that people can hold two irreconcilable truths in their head at the same time. They can, as long as they're not put right next to each other. And in that moment, they will choose. Right? Because let's say, you know what? I'm just going to reference this. How many of you have ever heard, by show of hands, like clappy hands, the phrase, a diamond is forever? Okay. This is one of the best examples of that I have ever heard. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask you this. If the thing that somebody already wants is the best symbol of their commitment to somebody else, and up to that point, as was true in 1947 when the tagline first came out, people had only been looking at the circle of metal as the symbol and not the stone. The moment they hear a diamond is forever, what happens? Uh-oh. Because they're not going to go, if I want the best symbol and I believe that a diamond is forever, suddenly the amethyst won't do. Because what is it saying? Stats aren't good, baby. Let's just keep going. Okay, so this means that change requires choice, but you don't have to worry about this too much because if you set this up, it will happen naturally. Okay, last place where I want to stay. I'm going to wrap all this together, but this is really important because when it comes to change, and I know this one's going to be hard for you as a speaker, you cannot want it more than they do. It's for the same reason, I'm going to switch to the little guy here, where I can be like, go left. Oh, it did. Go right. Go. Doesn't work. So our ball here tells us something very important, that once somebody understands what this will do for them, what your answer is, and why that's your answer, that's it. If they don't agree, if they don't want one of those elements, your only choice at that point, particularly if it's a message you're delivering from the stage, is to accept that that wasn't your people. That person was not your person. But somebody else in the audience does agree, and they are. So the last thing I want to finish here with is that all of this taken together, this is a really important point, that when all of this happens, there is no such thing as believer's remorse. See, when somebody wants to make a decision or wants to make a change, or they want something, and we just tell them what the answer is, 9 times out of 10, they're like, oh, no, why? Reactance. Why? Because from their point of view, that gap between where they are and where you want them to be is not empty. There's a crack in there, and his name is Frank. Okay, so our jobs, right, instead of just saying, come on over to the other side, is to build something strong enough to reduce the risk of change. And that, my friends, is the story that they are building, the argument they are telling themselves. So here's where I want to leave you today, that instead of asking for leaps of faith, build bridges of belief, step by step, on what people already want. When you put these 9 principles into practice, when you have that goal of building buy-in for even transformational change that lasts, it's all about saying what they can't unhear. These principles and how to apply them are in my 2 books. But fundamentally, what I want to leave you with is this, that when it comes to doing what you're doing and helping people make that transformational change, just make sure that you have a ball while doing it. Caps, thank you so much. Thank you.
Tamsen Webster! I know we are having a blast, but time is ticking and we are getting down to the wire. But right now, for the last time, I'd like to call to the stage your 2024 CAPS president. Please welcome Beverly Fireman King!
What's the high five? Pura vida, everybody. So I have a few things that I want to say. Part of the pleasure of being able to do this is to see the results of all of this. And, it's sad to see this come to a close. It's the 2024 CAPS convention, but I can't help reflect on the journey that we've had to kind of get to this point in beautiful San Jose, Costa Rica. For the first time in 27 years, we have stepped outside of our borders, we have embraced the unknown, and we have come together to create something I think is truly extraordinary. This convention has